Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable to you, O God, my rock and my redeemer. I'm in my office one day at Borough Hall when a gentleman I will call Jim came in to see me. The man was a contractor, and I had had some dealings with him on an office renovation project he had recently completed. And I wasn't aware of any other projects he had going on in the borough, so my curiosity was kind of piqued. I went to greet him, and we went into the conference room where our maps were hanging, and he used the maps to share his situation with me. Now, friends, the common sense solution to a situation was obvious. He knew it, and I knew it. But common sense was not going to solve his problem because of something in the way: laws. So I said to Jim, why don't you come to the next council meeting and explain your situation to the council members? And my hope was that I would gain their support to try and work up a solution for Jim's problem. So Jim comes in the next council meeting and shares his situation with the council. Now, many years before, Jim had purchased 2 lots on South Liberty Street. The lots are shown in this map. As the map indicates, Jim left the upper lot open and built his house on the lower lot. Now, you see that red line between the 2 lots? That's not a street. That is the boundary line between Origsburg Borough and West Brunswick Township. So Jim's house is in the township, not the borough. So Jim's house is not connected to the borough sewer system. Jim has an on-lot septic system that is failing. See that green line that runs down South Liberty Street? That's the borough's sewer main on its way past Jim's house to get to the wastewater treatment plant that's down there on South Liberty Street. So the solution is simple. Connect Jim's house to the sewer main running past his house. That red line on the map means we can't do that. It's amazing what difficulties lines on a map can cause. Now let me make this even more interesting. You see the dotted green line going up the street below Jim's house? The borough has an agreement with the township to provide sewage to the residents of that street, and we were waiting for the township to install the line. But for Jim to connect to that line, he'd have to get an easement to go through his neighbor's yard to connect, and he'd also have to install a pump, because we all know that there are some things that just don't go uphill. Now, everyone sitting at the council table that night knew what the common sense solution was to this problem, and knew it was not possible because of the current laws and the agreement that was in place. But our council president at the time came up with an interesting idea. He looked at Jim with a stern look and he said, "Jim, dig at night." What we all wanted was to help Jim meet his legal requirements as a property owner and do the best for his family. And we were all frustrated because of the obstacle that was placed in our way. For this was certainly a case where the law was getting in its own way. So now that we're finished with Lent and Easter, we can return to the Gospel of Mark. This morning we heard the last 6 verses of chapter 2 and the first 6 verses of chapter 3. 2 stories dealing with the Sabbath. But now remember, this is the Gospel of Mark. So even though it's only the end of chapter 2, a great deal has already taken place. And apparently some of it was unsettling to the Pharisees, because they've decided to trek from Jerusalem up to Capernaum to see what this Jesus fellow is up to. So let's recap. After his baptism in Jerusalem and his time in the wilderness, Jesus made his way back to Galilee. At the Sea of Galilee, he encountered Simon, Andrew, James, and John and called them to follow him. Then he enters the synagogue on the Sabbath and teaches with authority and expels an unclean spirit from a man. At this point, the text says that Jesus' fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. But apparently, first century social media worked pretty well because word made it back to Jerusalem. And the next thing you know, the Pharisees are in town. It seems not only were they in town, but they've decided to maintain a constant surveillance of Jesus and the disciples. It's the Sabbath. And Jesus and the disciples are walking through a grain field. And the disciples start to plug heads of grain. Now, it's interesting how differently translations are from one translator to the next. Because my translation said grain, what June read to us said corn. It's very interesting how these texts get translated differently. So, the Sabbath, the disciples started to pluck something, corn, wheat, whatever it was. And the Pharisees, there they are watching every step, asked Jesus why they were doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath. They can only ask this question if they were following Jesus and the disciples. Now, let's take a minute here to make sure we understand what the issue is here. Jesus and the disciples are walking through some farmer's field. The land did not belong to any of them. Plucking a few heads of grain or a few ears of corn to satisfy their hunger is not a violation of the law. In fact, the law requires that they be harvested by hand, so some would be left for gleaning. What the Pharisees contend is that they violated the law by doing it on the Sabbath. Now, the Deuteronomy text we just heard said that on the seventh day you shall not do any work. Exodus 34:21 gets a bit more specific. 6 days you shall work, but on the seventh day you shall rest. Even in plowing time and in harvest time you shall rest. So that text answers the question that may have occurred if you read the Deuteronomy text. What if you're a farmer? But now, we run into the same problem that it still exists in laws today. What do words mean? So what does it mean to work? What does it mean to harvest? Does plucking a few heads of grain constitute work or harvest? According to the Pharisees, the answer is yes. The Pharisees, in this case, are interpreting the law very strictly. Well, Jesus is having none of this. Jesus says, do you remember reading about David when he and his buddies were hungry and they went to the temple and they ate the bread only the priest could eat? Now, David may have been the greatest king, but when this happened, he was a fugitive from Saul. The priests set aside the law to meet David and his companions' need for food. Jesus knew the Pharisees wouldn't say anything bad about David. So he related what the disciples were doing with what David did. David ate the bread of the presence, the holy bread that only the priest could eat. And the disciples plucked the heads of grain or the ears of corn to meet their needs for food. The Sabbath is made for people, Jesus says, not the other way around. And besides that, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. So after getting the Pharisees angry at him out in the fields, Jesus walks into the synagogue. Now there's this poor guy with the withered hand. Now chances are this guy's sitting there minding his own business when Jesus walks in and the disciples walk in and the Pharisees walk in. And I have a hunch you could have cut the tension with a knife. Jesus spots the man. So now what do you think? You think this guy's ready to find a hole to crawl into so he can get away from all this tension and all this aggravation going on? Jesus says, come forward. So now this poor fellow's got to be up in front of everybody. Then Jesus asked the Pharisees a trick question. Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save a life or to kill? And they didn't answer. Well, see, here's the thing. In Jesus' time, if a building had collapsed on the Sabbath, people could dig through the rubble to try to rescue people without breaking the law. If the rescuers reached people trapped and they were alive, they could keep working. If the people trapped were not alive, they had to stop and wait until after the Sabbath to resume their work. That was the interpretation of the law. So here's Jesus with this poor man with the withered hand standing in front of them. And as far as the Pharisees are concerned, Jesus can wait till after the Sabbath to heal the man's hand. Again, it's not the action. It's not the healing. But it would be work taking place on the Sabbath. But for Jesus, the main purpose of the law is to save and preserve life. And what better day than the Sabbath to promote God's commitment to humanity's well-being and to restore this man's hand. And remember, Jesus isn't just fixing something. Jesus is restoring this man's hand so he can work again, so that he can provide for his family. Jesus is restoring this man's wholeness and dignity. So here's this man sitting in the synagogue, minding his own business, called to the front by Jesus, feeling the tension all around him, and Jesus says, "Stretch out your hand." Jesus is saying, you need to take a stand. You need to stand with me and not let these others control you. And the man acts with courage. He stretches out his hand, and it is healed. And the effort to destroy Jesus began right then. Stretch out your hand. Reading that now, it sounds like a simple thing to do. But imagine being the one standing in front of all of you, not only your neighbors and friends, but the leaders of your faith, the Pharisees. You know, it's interesting. I had many phone calls and visits from folks like Jim in my time managing the borough. First couple of times it happened, I said, let me talk to council. And I would share the situation with the council. Then it occurred to me that when I did that, I was letting the person off the hook. I wasn't asking them to take a stand. After that realization, my invitation to folks was, stretch out your hand. Come talk to council. It's amazing how many times the conversation ended with that invitation. Jim accepted my invitation to stretch out his hand, and after receiving the sage wisdom of the council president, the council, Jim, and I had a discussion about how we could reach a mutually beneficial solution to Jim's problem. I was given the go-ahead to find a way. It took some time, but after some conversations with some folks who all realized that the law should serve the person, we reached an agreement on how to solve Jim's problem. Jesus asked the man with the withered hand to take a stand, to stretch out his hand and acknowledge that he wants to be restored, he wants a better life. I asked Jim to take a stand to improve the quality of his life and his family's life. How about us? Do we need to stretch out our hand? Do we need to take a stand? Sabbath is God's gift to us. The Sabbath is about participating in and anticipating God's rest and God's justice for all. These are the gifts from God that make life human and full. And it is in this sense that the Sabbath was made for humankind. So do we need to take a stand for Sabbath? If you email our conference minister on her Sabbath, you will get this auto reply saying something along the lines of, "Today is my Sabbath. I do not check emails on my Sabbath." I will reply to her email when I return to work. Maybe we need to stretch out our hand and take a stand for others also. The Deuteronomy text says, on the Sabbath you shall not do any work. So if we go out to eat on the Sabbath instead of cooking, we're not working. But what about the employees of the restaurant? They are working. That verse goes on to say that those who serve us should do no work on the Sabbath either. So in a society where many are working more than one job, has the ability to keep Sabbath become a privilege not available to everyone? Are we stretching out our hand to change that? If laws are meant to serve all of us, then the law that forces some people to work more than one job just to make ends meet is denying some Sabbath and getting in its own way. Amen.